Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Sorry this video is coming late for some of you. Some of you might see this video in a year in the future. But the subject of this video for today is some of the short stories of, and a bit on the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe. So, if you guys remember from a previous video in the course, I mentioned that most writers in the 19th century didn't make a living off of writing. Most of them had other jobs. People like Nathaniel Hawthorne, for Nathaniel Hawthorne had a job at a customs house. He was a government bureaucrat. Herman Melville, after his writing career sort of flopped, worked at the docks in New York City. Compared to those guys, Edgar Allan Poe did make a pretty decent living as a writer. Of course, he misspent a lot of his money, but he was one of the few who actually did it. Just a little bit about the man himself, then I'll talk a bit for a minute or two about his stories, poetry. Poe, of course, everybody has some kind of relationship with Edgar Allan Poe coming into a literature course like this one. Of course, you guys probably in high school, you might have read stories like The Telltale Heart, maybe even earlier than high school. Lots of times people like to read Poe's stories through the lens of his life. As you guys probably know, Poe did lead a bit of a troubled life. He was addicted to opiates. He was addicted to alcohol. But that's a mistake to read his stories through his own experiences. We have to separate the author from the text. The text is its own sort of creation. It's independent of the author's intent. So even if Edgar Allan Poe did mean for his story to, even if he was writing about himself in the stories, right, that's still irrelevant, so to speak, because the text is its own creation, its own piece of art. Doesn't matter what the author's intentions were, we can read the art any way we want. But you guys probably know a lot about all of that. Of course, he died at a very young age. He's found dead. But let's talk, instead of kind of dragging the man himself through the mud, let's talk a bit about his work and contributions to American literature. So, Poe, of course, was a magazine editor. That was his main contribution. So he was responsible a lot for even things that got published. But Poe is most known for, well, he's known for his poetry. So we have in our readings for today two of his most famous poems, The Raven, as well as Annabelle Lee. Yeah, if you noticed, we've read Whitman before Poe. Poe's poetry is much more conventional than, let's say, Whitman. Whitman and Poe actually had a pretty contentious relationship. Whitman thought that Poe's poetry wasn't innovative enough compared to his new free-form, free-verse style. Poe's poetry still relies a bit on rhyme and meter, things like that. Of course, a lot of Poe's poetry as well relies on repetition. He expertly applies repetition in his work. Of course, if you just to give you an example, let me find Annabelle Lee for you. Of course, The Raven is a prime example of this as well. So you can kind of, as I read a few verses of Annabelle Lee, listen to the rhythm of the verse. It's kind of got Annabelle Lee kind of has a sing-song type type of meter to it. So it kind of has a duh 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 duh. It's got a very anapestic rhythm to it, meaning there's two unstressed syllables and then a stressed syllable. His lines are also a little shorter than, let's say, a Shakespearean sonnet. Okay, usually a Shakespearean sonnet has 10 syllables. Poe often has what's called trimeter, which means that I said 10 stressed syllables for a sonnet. That's actually 5. There's 10 syllables in a line. Poe's poetry has 3 stressed syllables compared to what's normally 5. His lines also are a bit shorter than what we're used to, but it's still conventional in the sense that kind of got that sing-song rhythm to it. It was many and many a year ago in a kingdom. I can kind of hear that, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabelle Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea. We loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabelle Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but you can hopefully that illustrated, this sort of the fact that his lines are a little bit shorter, but he also relies on things like clever repetition to achieve his purposes. It's the same thing in The Raven. If you read through The Raven, he's constantly going, quoth the Raven evermore. So I might give you guys a prompt whenever we talk about Poe, maybe contrasting some of their other poets we've read. How does he differ from Whitman's poems? How can we put Poe's poems in conversation with Emily Dickinson's poems? Maybe earlier poets like Anne Bradstreet. That's just a minute or two on his poetry. I'll post some more videos for you that go more in depth about it. But Poe is mostly known for his innovations within the Gothic genre. So, in American literature, there's almost 2 great Gothic writers before the Civil War, Poe and Hawthorne. So Poe's Gothic, you guys notice, well, of course, Washington Irving you can probably count too. But Poe's Gothic relies on first-person narrators. First-person narrators kind of... Poe invents what we call it's the limited first-person narrator. The unreliable narrator is the term. Unreliable narrator. So most of the time in a Poe story, it's being told through the perspective of someone who might be going mad. Right? Someone who's losing grip on their sanity. So as you read the story, you can't really trust what they're saying is to be absolute truth. It might be truth through their mind, that character's sort of diseased mind, but is it everything that they're saying completely true? And we can't rely on them. And that kind of adds a bit to the suspense of the story. Right? We're getting a story not told from an all-knowing, all-seeing narrator who's telling the story to us. We're getting the story through the mind of, like, a psycho, for instance. So that is an effect in Poe's Gothic stories. Was one of the ones that we read. My favorite one that we read for today is The Black Cat. I had you read The Fall of the House of Usher and The Black Cat in this particular version of the class. Which, if you guys know, in The Black Cat, the story starts with the narrator talks about how he's slowly descending into bad habits. Right, he's a drunk. His drunkenness causes him to beat his wife. But then he starts taking things out on this black cat, and eventually he kills it. He kills the first black cat. Well, as the story progresses, he slowly starts descending more and more into madness. So by the time the second black cat comes around, you have to ask yourself, well, is that black cat actually real, right? Or is this black cat a figment of narrator's imagination? Is it a symbol, perhaps, of his guilt? Of course, you guys know that he tries to murder the second black cat. He does murder his wife and buries her in the walls in his basement. But at the end of the story, the police show up. He thinks he's got away with the murder, and then he hears the black cat through the walls. Kind of tears down the walls, and the black cat is in there with his wife's corpse. Neat. So a great sort of, it's kind of a similar story to the Telltale Heart if you've read that one. But that's of course a symbol that we can't rely on those narrators. We don't know if that second black cat was actually, or did he lose his grip on reality. In that story, there's lots of themes that we can talk about. Theme of madness. There's the theme of, I talked before about reform movements. The temperance movement was a big deal in this time. This was when people were saying that alcohol was the root of all evil in American society. Well, this story kind of exemplifies that, right? This character kind of falls off the deep end because of his alcoholism. We had the death penalty as a theme in the Black Cat, right? At one point, he sees the gallows. He sees what a gallows would look like within the pattern of the Black Cat's fur. Right? So I told you guys before that there was also lots of debate about the death penalty at the time. So that's something that you can take away from it. He's also got this idea about perverseness in the story. There's another story he wrote called The Imp of the Perverse that goes into a similar subject. But he kind of has this idea that people do things that are against their best interest just because within our subconscious, perhaps, we have a tendency to self-destruct, do things that are against our own interests. So that is a theme within his story as well. He even calls it perverseness at one point in the story. So it's a great example of, and of course, if you noticed, setting is also something that's interesting in Poe's stories. Most of the time, his stories do not have an American setting. Or they might be set in America, but maybe the setting is left ambiguous in some way. It could be set anywhere. So lots of times in his stories, they might be set in Italy, somewhere in Europe, instead of America. But we can even kind of imagine them taking place in America. Setting isn't really relevant so much to his stories, except in the case of the fall of the House of Usher. Which, if you just to mention the fall of the House of Usher for a moment, that story is about Roderick Usher and his sister, and the narrator of the story, friend who comes to visit them. Of course, the setting is kind of paramount to that story, right? But this seems more like it's set in Europe. We have this old, great sort of mansion that belonged to the aristocrats, aristocracy, and the Roderick and his sister are sort of the last of the line, right? If they don't reproduce, then the family name is going to die. Well, so much of the story of that story's mood comes from that setting. Right? This house is kind of decaying, kind of falling in. The house seems rotten in some type of way. Something isn't right here. Well, I don't know if you guys read through the lines in the story, but there's an insinuation that there's some sort of incest between the brother and the sister, which is causing a lot of this sort of the setting of the house then becomes almost a symbol for the sort of nasty stuff that's going on, with the siblings. Of course, the end of the story when they leave, the house crumbles. Right, really dramatic. But that story has an interesting stuff going on as well. Was she actually still alive and been buried alive? That was also a, that was also a fear that Poe wrote about a lot. Fear of being buried alive. Um, so that's just a bit. Can't go too much into detail about any of these, but that's a bit on his two Gothic stories that we read. Of course, the setting of the Raven, the poem, is also interesting. Right, it takes place in this guy's bedroom. Right. The last thing I want to mention about Poe is his contributions to the detective story. You guys read the story for today, the Purloined Letter. Yeah, I'm not gonna go too much into detail about that, but I had you reading that one just to see a different sort of Poe, what we're used to with the Gothic. We owe it, as far as American literature goes, we owe it a lot to Poe for sort of innovating these detective stories, mysteries, detectives figuring out something that's going wrong. So this whole story is about how this detective is kind of ahead of the game and figuring out where this letter is, who is keeping it. And so a lot of that kind of stuff was going on in Britain. We had writers like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was writing the Sherlock Holmes stories at the time too. But Poe was one of our main innovators within this genre in America. So that's another contribution of his to American literature. The fact that not only a Gothic writer and they innovated that, but also the detective story. Poe's Poe's inclusion within American literature canon is an interesting subject to talk about. We didn't see a lot of it in these stories we read for today, but Poe was a Southerner. Oftentimes he painted blackness, as something to be feared. So he's being debated about a lot today. This does he should he still be included within the books and all that? I just wanted to make you aware of that. He's kind of fallen in and out of favor over the years. A lot of the literature critics in the 50s and 60s didn't really like Poe so much. But in the 80s and 90s, he kind of made a comeback because of historical ways of reading literature. So lots of he's an interesting character, right? So hopefully I gave you guys some background on his importance to American literature. So as you guys might write about him, probably going to have you put him in a conversation with Hawthorne some way, or some of the other poets. So watch out for that. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this brief lecture on one of our most important writers. Like I said, he was one of the only ones to actually make a living off of it. He's not going anywhere anytime soon. He's a writer that's captured the public's imagination. You ask the normal person who Nathaniel Hawthorne is, the normal person's not going to know, but pretty much everybody knows the name Edgar Allan Poe. So until next time, take care, guys. Enjoy your reading.